Okay, so where we left off in the life of Josephus was at the very beginning of the war. But we weren't reading it from the point of view of the war, we were reading it from the point of view of Josephus's life itself. That is to say, his explanation of his own behavior. We'll get to a repetition of this from a different perspective, actually, the history of the war very soon. So, as you remember, Josephus is in Jerusalem, and this is around, hang on a second, okay, this is very close to 66 in the Common Era. Right? Josephus is born in 32, I think it is.
37.
Or 37, you're right. Yeah, 37. And he finds himself, he's returned from Rome, he's impressed by the power of Rome, and he's basically a pacifist in the sense that he feels that the only solution that can work is a non-military solution. Mm-hmm. That a military solution will doom the Jewish people, Israel, to a terrible end. Now, keep in mind that he's writing this looking backward. So he's not predicting the future. He's saying, in the past, that is to say, already he's in Rome when he's writing this. And he's saying, but I knew then that the people who wanted war with Rome would doom us. Right? He lays the responsibility for the catastrophe at the feet of two groups of people. On one side, and primarily on what he would describe as the brigands and the robbers and the bandits and the extremists, called sometimes the Sicarii for the short daggers that they wore, and zealots more commonly. On one side. On the other side, he lays the blame at the hands of the administrators of the emperors. That is to say, he doesn't blame the emperors themselves, but he blames the governors, the Roman governors, who exacted very unfair taxes and created hostilities that were unnecessary. That they were also very corrupt. They personally benefited from what happened, and their hatred of the Jewish people as a group caused tremendous anger within Israel. And there were incidences in which Roman soldiers in Jerusalem, there's no pleasant way to say this, took off his underclothes and faced his behind to the people from the Temple Mount during Passover and let out a very large noise. Other times
very childish, no?
Mm-hmm. Very childish and very provocative, right? And he suffered no, the soldier suffered no punishment for it. Mm-hmm. And the people demanded a punishment for it. The building of a Roman eagle on the gates of the temple and their destruction, the actual building of or the planned building of a Caesar, a statue of Caesar to be put into the temple, Zeus with the Caesar's face. Mm-hmm. So there were a lot of provocations. One of the most troubling elements of it was an element of favoritism shown by the procurators and the governors of Judea on two levels. One was they befriended the powerful among the Jews, and those were mostly the Sadducees. And the Sadducees were a strange combination of because they were wealthy and powerful, and the Romans were powerful, there was a kind of natural alliance on one side, and on the other side, religiously, they were what we might call fundamentalists, in that they held only by the written Torah and not by the rabbinic views. So it was a strange combination. And yet, by the way, when the war broke out, the Sadducees definitely sided with their Jewish compatriots. But they were very much against the war breaking out, and they had many benefits from this relationship in terms of, very often, we've talked about this in more modern history, very often when there's a disaster in the economy or politics, the people who suffer are often not the poorest, who remain the poorest. They've lived with very little, they continue to live with very little, and ironically, not the wealthiest either. It's the people in the middle who suffer the most. The economy is destroyed, the industry is destroyed. Those people who have land and wealth and resources continue. But those people who are doing business are in deep trouble. By the way, this is happening today in Greece. The poorest people in Greece are actually living the same life that they were living before. And the wealthiest, don't have their money in Greece. They have it other places. Right? But it's that group in the middle that is feeling tremendous pain. So it was in Judea at this time, on one side. The other side is, I've mentioned this earlier, is that we think of Israel as a Jewish place. But it wasn't just Jewish. There were many other nationalities there. And the Romans, to some degree, like the British did when they built their empires, when you build an empire, and it's a global empire, you're outnumbered by the people you rule. Right? So one of the mechanisms for ruling in such a situation is divide and conquer. So you will, when you move into India, you will take these powerful groups and make them part of the British Empire, and they will serve you, right? And they will serve you by suppressing their fellow Indians, right? And so it was with Rome, that Rome would conquer nations with their armies, but then conscript into their armies the conquered nations. Now, they wouldn't be Roman citizens. It'd take 25 years for a soldier who is a member of the Roman auxiliary force, which is a non-Roman. If he served after 25 years, he would have the privileges of Roman citizenship. But for 25 years, he put his life on the line, right, fighting Rome's battles without being Roman, right? So this was also true in Israel at the time, was that Rome befriended other nations, gave them privileges, removed all taxation from them. They lived tax-free.
For example,
right?
Who lived in Israel?
Parthians, Scythians, many non-Jewish groups, Idumeans, many non-Jewish groups lived also in Israel at the time. Samaritans, large numbers of others. And one of the things that the Roman governors did was they said, you live tax-free. Now, to make up the missing taxes, you have a tax base. It's the Jews, right? And since you despise them and hate them, and they view them as a rebellious enemy right from the beginning, you tax them more heavily, right, to make up the missing taxes you give to the privilege, right? So this creates not just hatred against the Romans, but it actually creates hatred between the Jews and the non-Jews who are living tax-free. You can imagine, right? If we're living in this community here, right? Some people are paying taxes, some people are not paying taxes. Those people who are paying taxes are paying for the other people to have free schools, right? Somehow it doesn't feel right, right? And eventually it leads to tremendous hostility. So this was the cauldron that was boiling at the time that we're entering the scene. And Rome was playing all of these elements, right, against the Jews, right? Including Jews themselves, right? Including Jews themselves. So, as you remember, what happened was that we talked about Gesius and his son had come to Jerusalem. And this was something that Josephus had been waiting for, right? And they were badly beaten. The Romans were badly beaten at this moment, right? And Josephus is very worried about this because he says now the people who beat them, meaning the Zealots, the Sicarii, but it was not just them. This was a revolt that had begun as a populist revolt. It wasn't simply a small band of well-trained, violent commandos. They were facing thousands of Roman troops, and they beat them very, very badly. And now Josephus, who was waiting for this salvation, is very distraught. And remembering that as he's writing always in the distant past from this event. So he puts his own spin on why he is disappointed. His disappointment is that the victory of the Jewish revolt in Jerusalem over the governor puts the people who he will describe for the rest of the story as the villains, the radicals, the extremists, in a much more powerful position. They said they could beat the Romans came, and they beat the Romans. So now they're in a position of great political power within their own communities, number one. Number two is there is also seething in the north rebellion as well, in the Galilee. So that's where we enter the scene, right? And he says that in the north, he says, for those that were fond of war were so far elevated that this success, that they had hopes of finally conquering the Romans, of which war another occasion was ministered, which was this. Those that dwelt in the neighboring cities of Syria seized upon such Jews as dwelt among them with their wives and children and killed them, and when they had not the least occasion of complaint against them, for they did neither attempt any innovation or revolt against the Romans. So in the north, on what is the border of Syria, right, where there were communities living together of Jews and Gentiles, this was an opportunity for the Gentiles to attack the Jewish populations who were completely innocent. There was no revolt at this point, and they attacked women, children, and of course the men as well, and killed them, massacred them.
But it wasn't Romans, it was Syrians.
It was non-Jewish Syrians living tax-free, protected by Rome, right? But keep in mind what he's telling us, right? It's a very important thing to say. This didn't happen because they were evil. It happened because in Jerusalem, the Zealots won, right? So the reaction of the neighbors up north was kill the Jews, right? Now, this shouldn't entirely surprise us, right? You know, we mentioned this last week. When the Gaza War happened, people attacked Jews in France, in Germany, right? In Canada as well, right? So there is this sense that give us an excuse and we'll go forward with it. But Josephus, our objective historian, isn't saying, look, those people are just evil people who use this as an excuse. He's saying the reason they did this was because of the Zealots. Right, and the Sicarii. And he goes on.
The Jews are always a scapegoat.
He said, but this was done by the inhabitants of Scythopolis, which was what happened there was the most impious and highly criminal of all. For when the Jews, their enemies, came upon them, from without, they forced the Jews that were among them to bear arms of their own countrymen. So Scythopolis we know also as Beit Shean. Beit Shean is here, right?
Jordan Valley.
Yeah, Beit Shean is here. Just to get a sense, Jerusalem is here, right? Mm-hmm. So what he's saying is that the Jews of Beit Shean were forced to take up arms by the Zealots at this point, right?
Because they were attacked by neighbors.
No. The ones who were attacked by neighbors were further north, right?
Oh, okay.
But he's mixing things together, and because he wants to get a result, right? In Jerusalem, there was a revolt, and the Romans were beaten. Mm-hmm. In the far north, near Syria, Jews were slaughtered, right? Mm-hmm. Jews from Jerusalem, right, and from the Galilee itself, right, went to Beit Shean and forced the inhabitants of Beit Shean, mm-hmm. who didn't want to revolt, to take up arms, right, mm-hmm. for fear that they would be killed by their fellow Jews, right? Okay. Jews were among those to bear arms against their own countrymen, which is unlawful for us to do. And then he gives some examples, references in his footnotes to, that you can't stand in your brother's blood, references to halacha, that Jews can't attack other Jews, right? And when by their assistance they joined battle with those who had attacked them and had beaten them after the victory, they forgot the assurances they had given these their fellow citizens and allies and killed them, being in the number of nearly 13,000. He's saying that 13,000 Jews were killed, and it's unclear at this point whether he's saying that they were killed by the Sicarii, by the Romans, or by the non-Jews. He's going to clarify it later, right? The like miseries were undergone by those Jews that were inhabitants of Damascus. They were slaughtered. But we have given a more accurate accounts of these things in the books of the Jewish War. I only mention them now because I would demonstrate to my readers the Jews' war with the Romans is very important. The Jews' wars with the Romans was not voluntary, but that for the main they were forced to enter into it. Mm-hmm. Okay?
By Jews,
by Zealots, by the hawks, the political hawks. They were forced into it, right? Mm-hmm. There's still a very large group that is looking for a diplomatic solution, right? Now remember, the Roman involvement in Israeli politics goes all the way back to Pompey, roughly 100 years earlier. And so the Jews have been trying to find ways either to lift the Roman yoke, right, or to manage life within the Roman yoke during this whole time, right? It hasn't always been a time, in fact, it really hasn't been a time of violence at all. It's been a time of political pressure, of meeting with the emperor, of making deals, of trying to find solutions, all the kind of things that, land for peace, whatever, they're managing as they go along, trying to find a way to live with this great empire that, has its hands in Israeli politics. And what's gone on, you should understand, is that Rome has vacillated from emperor to emperor in terms of how it deals with Israel. Sometimes it deals with Israel as putting in a puppet king that rules. Herod is the most famous example, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes it says, these Jewish kings are too much of a problem, we're making it a province. And then the next emperor says, well, I like the puppet king thing worked well. So they go back to a puppet king, and then they make it a province again with direct rule. Yes?
Do we know in history other provinces, but now they rule pretty much all known world? Is there any trouble happens similar to somewhere else? It's everywhere there?
Yes, there is.
It means it's just difficult to run empire.
No? Yes. If a household is difficult, think about an empire. The question that Yelena raises, of course, it becomes much more vivid in the final revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt, where Rome is now fighting for its very existence. This is a point that is rarely understood, that throughout the empire at that point there were monotheistic revolts going on, not just in Israel. But Israel was viewed, from Rome's point of view, as the core of this problem, which is why the final battles with Bar Kokhba were so vicious on the part of Rome. Normally an empire doesn't want to destroy its colonies. It wants to benefit from its colonies. You know, whatever wealth, whatever knowledge, whatever resources it has, you want to be able to take from it and tax it. Right? What Rome did to Israel was, in the end, in the not this revolt, but in the final revolt of Bar Kokhba, was an attempt to destroy all vestiges of monotheism.
So they wanted to completely destroy the Jews?
They wanted to completely destroy Judaism and the Jews. So it wasn't limited to the Jews. It was limited actually to the land of Israel as well. You know, the idea of salting the land so nothing will grow is almost bizarre in a sense, because after you've emptied the land of the Jews, whoever moves in can't plant anything either. And not only that, you are actually ruling a land whose agriculture you just destroyed. You know, it doesn't make sense except for the anger and the viciousness of it on one side. But the viciousness of it, and this is something that we always have trouble coming to grips with, the viciousness of it is not unfounded. It's not unfounded. The viciousness is not about, it's not about the fact that the Jews were vicious with the Romans specifically. It's that we always think of these battles as, you know, a distant small colony against the great empire, and how foolish it is. But the reason Rome fought and destroyed us as they did was not because they didn't like us, because they thought we were going to destroy them. This was, in a sense, their last stand, that if they were unable to destroy this monotheistic revolt that was going on throughout their empire, the empire would fall. Now, the irony to it, it wasn't long after that Constantine made it the Holy Roman Empire. If you can't beat him, what's the expression?
Get along with.
If you can't beat him, join him. So what they did was they did a unfriendly takeover of monotheism. Right? They created Christianity as a national religion of the Roman Empire. Took down the Roman eagle, put up the cross, and said, "This is our religion. He's our guy." Right? And in so doing, they effectively destroyed these revolts. This was Constantine's brilliant...
The Jewish revolts.
The monotheistic revolt, right? That was Jewish. It was also Christian. They were afraid of the Christians as well. You know.
But the time that you're talking about, it was the time when a lot of non-Jews, they became
a lot of Romans.
Romans.
Senators.
A lot
of Roman senators, and more than senators,
converted to Judaism.
Not just Jews, they became Bnei Noach. Bnei Noach or Jews. A lot.
Yeah, the one thing
in Talmud, a lot of rabbis who are talking in Talmud, they're not Jews. They're or Gerim or Bnei Gerim.
Rabbi Meir. He's a descendant of Roman royalty. You know, it's and these things were impacting. They were cross-fertilizing, but it was doing much more damage to Roman society than it was to Jewish society. You know, the Jews were succeeding at keeping a monotheist, but that's why, for instance, Acher is such a problem for us. You know, Elisha ben Avuya, right? Is that you know, he was somebody who separated and went on a different path, who was a great Talmudic scholar, right? So there was a lot of cross-fertilization, some of which wasn't good, but most of it was to the detriment of Rome, right? And the weak underbelly, the exposed underbelly of Rome was in fact the women, right? Because the women of Rome were tremendously attracted to monotheism, as was the men. But in order to become Jewish, you didn't have to undergo Brit Milah, circumcision. Right? The men did, and they resisted this for obvious reasons. Right? So the wives of Rome were very, very supportive. And we see this even in Josephus. Who's helping Josephus? It's the wife of the emperor, right? He has access to her. How? Through a Jewish actor, right?
No, it was a wife. She was a friend with the wife of the...
That's another piece of it. That's another piece of it, right? The wives were friends as well. But earlier on, right, remember we saw that Josephus returned the priests because a Jewish actor connected him with the empress, and she manipulated the situation. That's his version of the story, right? So the women of Rome were already very, very much attracted to monotheism and Judaism, and many stories of famous rabbis, including Rabbi Akiva, who spent time in Rome teaching and speaking, and their largest audiences generally were royal women. We came to hear them. Anyway, back to our story, which is we're reading now about the beginning of what will become the Great Revolt, which will end in the destruction of the temple. Okay? So his point is that the Jews were forced into it, right? It's really part, as is true with most propaganda, there is a very big element of truth in it, but there's a lot of pieces missing, right? They were forced into it. Why were the radicals so successful? Why did they have so much popularity? Because of very evil governors that were doing terrible, terrible things. Right? So when Gessius had been beaten, as we have said already, the principal men of Jerusalem, seeing that the robbers and the revolutionaries had arms in great plenty, and fearing lest they, while they lacked arms, should be in subjugation to their enemies, which was the case afterwards, and being informed that all the Galilee had not yet revolted from the Romans, but that some part of it was still quiet, they sent me and 2 other priests, who were men of excellent character, Joazar and Judas, in order to persuade the ill men that they should lay down their arms and teach them this lesson. What is this all about? It's all clear?
Not really.
No? Okay, so Josephus...
Who sent him?
Josephus is building his argument as to how he found himself as the leader of the Galilean forces against Rome. He's saying that the good men of Jerusalem, not the revolutionaries, not the Sicarii, not the Zealots, understood that large caches of weapons were available. What had happened, among other things, in this revolt was Roman weapons had fallen into the hands of the Jews, right? And how those weapons were going to be used was the issue. So now, what we understand...
Can I ask you a question? What is a weapon? It's not like there was a bullets. What is a...
Swords, shields.
How many swords do you need?
Arrows.
Yeah,
What?
Arrows you need.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's not like a gun which you shoot.
No, but swords are destroyed in war. You need new ones.
It's before firearms were invented.
Swords. Yes, this is why I say.
But you're also dealing with what you're thinking is okay. So
You have a sword and you keep it. Hold on to it.
right.
Don't lose
So
it.
first of all, you don't have an armed population, right? Rome is armed, right? And finding a cache of weapons would be a capital crime in this situation, right? You don't use a sword to plow the fields. The swords will be turned into plowshares, not quite the reverse, right? Right? When the Romans would find that kind of thing, they would understand we're dealing with a group of revolutionaries here, let's deal with them. And they had very, very short judicial process, ending in crucifixion usually. But now, anybody knows that whenever revolutionaries begin a revolution, they do things like attack police stations, right, to get their small arms. They're not going after, Stinger missiles and armored vehicles. That comes later, right? Initially, you go after the police to one, free the prisoners, which causes chaos, right? Number one, and number two, to get the small arms to continue the battle, right? So the equivalent of swords and shields, right? So the men of Jerusalem understood that these weapons had been taken from the Romans, right? Now what to do, right? So keep in mind, all of this is actually for one reason, to explain how I, Josephus, found myself as leader of the forces in the Galilee. Because I've told you, right from the beginning, as I write my memoirs in Rome, that I was not a revolutionary. I thought it was a terrible idea, right? Because, my name, by the way, he was given the palace of Vespasian in Rome. It's where he lived out his life. Vespasian, who became emperor, didn't need his palace anymore. His general's palace, because now he's the emperor, right? So they gave it to Josephus. He was a very loyal servant, and he was rewarded occasionally. That's where he's sitting when he's writing these documents, right? So it would be inappropriate for him to describe himself here as, I was a revolutionary, I went to the Galilee to stop Vespasian from entering Israel in, etc. No, it was a very complicated time, you must understand, right? We had this revolt in Jerusalem. There were a lot of weapons there, right? It was falling into the hands of the bandits and the zealots. Right? The reasonable men of Jerusalem sent me and 2 other priests to the north, right? In the north, there was a division. Part of the north was already in revolt. Part of it was not, right? They sent me there, not as a leader of the military. They sent me there to tell the revolutionaries, put down your arms. Now is not the time.
The peacemaker.
Now is not the time. Right?
He wasn't scared to go?
I was, well, you're raising a very important point, right?
Yeah.
But he went there with the authority of the leadership of the Jewish nation.
Bodyguards,
right?
probably too.
Whether it was the members of the Sanhedrin, the priesthood, whoever it was, they were credible people who sent him, right? And didn't send him alone, right? So, remember, he's the guy who brought back the priest. He's a very smart fellow, right? So, he's explaining what's going on, right? They sent me and 2 other priests, right? And Joazar and Judas, in order to persuade the ill men that they should lay down their arms and to teach them this lesson. About what I'm going to say, that it were better to have those arms reserved for the most courageous men that the nation had than to be kept there. For that it had been resolved that our best men should always have their arms ready against future developments, but still so that they should wait to see what the Romans would do. Right? So his argument with the revolutionaries is not, this is a bad idea, this war. It's a bad tactic to show your strength in your weapons right now. Hide your weapons, put them aside, act peacefully, right? And make sure that the weapons aren't indiscriminate. Put these weapons into the hands of the best fighters that we have, right? That to put them in the hands of farmers and people, Talmudic scholars or whatever, right? That's not what you do with weapons. We have fighters, we have trained people, right? Right? Put them in their hands, and I'll make sure they, let me control it. I'll make sure they get into the right hands at the right moment. But right now, let's just see what the Romans are going to do. There was an expression at the time of the Revolutionary War, was hold your fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Right? That is to say, the weapons that the American revolutionaries had were not very accurate. They were long rifles and more than 100 feet away, you never knew what you were going to hit when you fired. Right. So the expression was you had to hold your fire you're in the trees, right, waiting, don't fire until you can see the whites of their eyes, that they're that close to you, right? So that's what Josephus is saying here. He's saying, put your weapons away, act peacefully, and let's see what the Romans do. If they make peace with us, we don't have to use our weapons. If they don't make peace with us, then our best fighters will have our best weapons, and we'll beat them. Right? So he's talking the language that the zealots want to hear, without encouraging them to fight. Say, I'm with you. I'm with you. When the time comes, I'm the guy who's going to lead you in this battle.
But is that putting them into danger?
So, no, he's saying, they're not attacking you at this moment. Don't attack them. Right? When I had therefore received these instructions, I came to the Galilee and found the people of Sepphoris in no small agony about their country, by reason that the Galileans had resolved to plunder it on account of their friendship with they had with the Romans, and because they had given their right hand and made league with Cestius and Gallius, the president of Syria. So, what's he saying? He's saying that they were the people of Sepphoris, and Sepphoris is... Okay, Sepphoris is here in the Galilee, right? So it's quite close. To what will be the final battle in Jopata. Right, here's Sepphoris, right? And those people are in great anguish at this point. Why? Right? Because they seem to have made a deal with the Romans, right? And they've actually done exactly what Josephus wants everybody to do. Make a deal with the Romans, don't rebel. Right? But the other Galileans, the revolutionaries, right, have resolved to destroy Sepphoris themselves. Right? So you can see there's this terrible situation that's going on. And the Gemara actually makes a comment about this. It says, where is it? It says, it's from Sanhedrin. It says, Israel did not go into exile until there were 24 sects of heretics. Right?
24
sects, groups of heretics, right?
Sects.
Yeah, it's a little unclear what they mean by heretics here, right? They were people who didn't believe along with the view of the Pharisees. So the Sadducee were considered heretics, right, by them as well. But what does it mean? So I just want to pause and say, if I ask people in this room, what does the Gemara tell us? Why was the Second Temple destroyed? What is the expression that we all know? What was the cause of destruction of the Second Temple?
The hatred between the Jews.
Sinat chinam, right?
Sinat chinam.
Hatred for no reason, Jew to Jew.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, and the very famous story is given of Kamsa bar Kamsa, right? Of somebody who was insulted, and then he told the emperor. He went to Rome, told the emperor the Jews are rebelling. And they won't accept your sacrifice. We know the story. It leads to Tisha B'Av. Very central story to Tisha B'Av. Right? With all due respect, right, one should keep in mind, right, that the destruction of the Second Temple, not Beitar, not Bar Kokhba, which happens some 60 years later, but the destruction of the Second Temple is exactly Sinat Chinam, but not on the scale of one Jew not inviting another Jew to his wedding,
To the party, yeah.
right? And so he's upset. It wasn't on the level. It's like, we have Jews here who are killing each other.
National level.
What?
National level.
On a national level, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? So that there were situations where whole cities are being threatened by Jewish zealots, right? Who are seen as cooperating with the enemy, right? In other situations, individuals in large gatherings of Jews in Jerusalem are being found dead after the gathering, that they've been assassinated by other Jews, right? More than that, Roman governors at times hired the Sicarii to do their dirty work, because the Sicarii were made up of a combination of zealots and also bandits as well. There were elements of it to it, right? The Josephus describes them all as being immoral and bandits, right? They weren't. There were many that had very noble ambitions of freedom. That they were, that freedom would be at the center of it. But there were that as well. So this whole idea of sinat chinam, hatred for no reason, for God's sake, we have enough enemies. We don't have to be our own enemies, right? And we see that the destruction of the Second Temple, to a very large degree, can be laid at the hands of, not as Josephus pointed to this group, but to the sense of there's no unity. There's so much lack of unity that the Romans benefit from it constantly. That, we'll destroy our own supplies, right, in order to defeat an internal enemy, right, where we're under siege and the Romans are trying to kill us. Right? It was crazy, He says specifically, I think we're going to get to it in a second, that in his view, the destruction of the Second Temple has to do with these hatreds, right? And he's not talking about Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, right, at all. Okay, so let's go on here, right? There were 3 factions in this city. This is... I'm sorry. All right. He said, because Rome had given their right hand and made league with Cestius and Gallus, the president of Syria. But I delivered them all out of the fear they were in, and persuaded the multitude to deal kindly with them, and permitted them to send those that were their own hostages with Gessius and Dora, which is a city to Gessius, with Gessius to Dora, which is a city in Phoenicia, which is really Lebanon, as often as they pleased, though I still found the inhabitants of Tiberias ready to take up arms, and that on occasion the following, right? And he's going to tell us something that happened after. So he's saying, I was able to calm the people of Sepphoris, the people who were ready to attack Sepphoris, so that they could get their people out and survive, basically, to a safer place. This is all about what he's doing, how he's calming the waters in order to save people. Right? There were 3 factions in the city. The first was composed of the men of worth and gravity. Of these, Julius Capellus was the head. Now he, as well as all his companions, Herod the son of Marius, these names sound familiar, Herod the son of Gamulus, and Campusus, the son of Campusus, as for Campusus' brother Crispus, who had been governor of the city until the great king Agrippa. So these are all Jews he's talking about.
With Roman names.
Yeah, exactly. With Roman and Greek names, right? So these are not people that the revolutionaries would find very trustworthy, I suspect, right? But he refers to them as men of worth and gravity, right? They were likely Saduci as well.
Did they convert to Christianity? Or?
No.
Locally took
This is not about Christianity at all, right? This is about Rome, right? Christianity is not a factor in this, right?
Romans were not Christian.
All these persons before named gave their advice that the city should and then continue in their allegiance to the Romans and to the king. King Agrippa was at this point a puppet king of the Romans. But Pistus, who was guided by his son Justus, did not acquiesce to that resolution. Otherwise, he was himself naturally of good and virtuous character, except for this one decision. But the second faction was composed of the most ignoble persons and was determined for war. But as for Justus, the son of Pistis, who was the head of the third faction, although he pretended to be doubtful about going to war, yet he desired change, as supposing that he should gain power by the change of affairs. So for some people, right, the political decisions, right, involve not so much simply the nobility of going to war or making deals with the Romans, but I can gain personal power. Right? So Josephus is saying, in this case, right, this group, the third group, right, saw themselves as gaining political power by their behavior. He therefore came into the midst of them and tried to inform the multitude that the city Tiberias was ever been a city of Galilee, and that in the days of Herod the Tetrarch, who had built it, it had obtained the principal place, and that he had ordered the city, and he had ordered that the city Sepphoris should be subordinate to the series of Tiberius, that is to say, Herod had done that, and that they had not lost this preeminence even under Agrippa the father, but had retained it until Felix, the governor, right, the procurator of Judea, the governor of Judea. But he told them that now they had been so unfortunate as to be made a present by Nero to Agrippa the Junior, right? There was an Agrippa who was the father of Herod, and there was an Agrippa who was the son and grandson of was the popular name, to Agrippa Junior. Nero had given the city, and that upon Sepphoris' submission of itself to the Romans, that it had become the capital of the Galilee. So now Tiberias is no longer the capital of the Galilee. The Romans have decided Sepphoris will be, right? And Sepphoris is also going to be loyal to Rome, right? And that the royal library and the archives were now removed from them. And when he had spoken these things, and a great many more, against King Agrippa in order to provoke the people to revolt, he added, this was the time for them to take arms and join with the Galileans as their allies, whom they might command, and who would now willingly assist them out of hatred that they bore to the people of Sepphoris. Right? So this is a group within Sepphoris is saying, let's fight the Romans. We'll get help from the people of Tiberias, right, who hate the people who have made the deal with the Romans. Right? These are all Jews. There are no Romans involved in this discussion at all so far, because they preserved their faithfulness to the Romans, and to gather a great number of forces in order to punish them. And as he said this, he exhorted the multitude to go to war, for his abilities lay in making harangues to the people, and in being too hard in his speeches for such as those who opposed them. He accused anybody who opposed them not of being a peacemaker, but of being a collaborator. Much more serious, right? Now you can imagine who he might have seen as the major collaborator. Who would have been seen the major collaborator is Josephus. You know, he's coming from Jerusalem and spreading this, let's cooperate with the Romans talk, right? But he's careful about it, because he's not saying, I really want to cooperate. He's saying, I want to wait for the right moment before we attack, right? Though they had advised him what was more to their advantage, and this by his craftiness and his fallacies, for he was not unskillful in the learning of the Greeks. He was a cultured person and a good orator. And in dependence on that skill, the skill as an orator, it was that he undertook to write a history of these affairs as aiming by this way of haranguing to disguise the truth. Now this person, I believe, is going to become a major enemy of Josephus. You can see it's being set up. And he writes and I don't think it exists anymore, a counter-history of the wars in the Galilee. Right?
So he's like working
and Josephus sitting in Rome in Vespasian's palace,
right,
after the wars, after the destruction of the temple, saying there is another history that exists. There's a Jewish historian living in Tiberias, right?
Version.
And he wrote the Zealots' view of this. And by the way, if you think that he had trouble finding a villain, he didn't. It was me.
Josephus.
And obviously, he's not credible. I'm credible.
So go figure.
So he's setting up this defense.